Hello and welcome to the Microlise podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Summers. I'm head of global marketing for Microlise, and I'm here today with Jonathon Backhouse. Jonathon, would you be able to just give us a short introduction to yourself, your role, and your experience in transport and logistics from a legal point of view?
I'm a solicitor, Backhouse Jones Solicitors. I've specialised in regulatory road transport work since the mid-90s. I come from a background of solicitors, so I'm seventh generation. My father was also specialising in road regulatory, and he took that over from his father in, I think, 1959.
Wow.
So, we've got a long line of looking after hauliers, bus operators and coach operators.
So obviously you also took part today in the webinar roundtable with the other guests. What was kind of some of the key standout points and any of your own personal takeaways from today, be it some news or anything that you kind of reiterated some of your thinking in the industry?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at any discussion on regulatory law, particularly when you've got the Enforcement Agency and the Traffic Commissioner there, who are basically the two organisations that manage operators where they're not meeting their regulatory requirements, it's always interesting to have that discussion. I don't think anything came out today that's unknown or unusual. I think there's a lot of similarity actually between all the different organisations in the room about what we want. I think there's certainly a desire by everybody involved to make and keep the roads as safe as they can. One thing that I think, and it's always the case, is we concentrate on the negative. We spend all our time saying we need to improve this, we need to improve that, this isn't good enough, that's not good enough. Actually, we are extremely good in the UK. And our ability to prevent incidents and accidents being far higher by number is led by our regulatory regime, and it's working. And so I think we should sometimes just stop and ask ourselves, at what point do we have to acknowledge that we're not going to make massive improvements going forwards? There are always going to be road traffic deaths. There are always going to be road traffic collisions. And the reason for that is that sometimes people do it deliberately. Sometimes people do it because they're not very well. And events happen just due to weather or other conditions that aren't going to be able to be easily managed on a management perspective, which is what this was all about.
Yeah, and I think you and I have personally talked about driver well-being being a topic that kind of, doesn't get as much of the spotlight as it probably should do. And I kind of want to understand from your point of view, what level of role does driver well-being take in terms of some of those, cases that you've been involved in personally or within your own business? Yeah,
it's an ever-increasing role. Let's start there. So 20 years ago, was anybody asking how the driver felt? The short answer is probably not. There will be the odd operator out there saying, yeah, I did it, but most didn't. I think today, what's become really relevant in society, never mind in your drivers, with all employees, is that you have to be much more aware of an individual's feelings, much more aware of an individual's personal life, if you like, and where they're at and the issues and challenges they've got personally, because that might make a difference to their performance in their role. Now, in an office like mine, that might make a little bit of a performance every now and again, impact on performance every now and again. But when you're dealing with people who are in safety critical environments, like driving large vehicles on our roads, then it's much, much, much more important. It's much more important to be aware of it. It's much more important to train managers and staff to look out for it, to respond appropriately to it. And the biggest single piece of advice I'd give anybody on well-being is if you've got a concern, your first step is to take the person off the road.
And do you think there's any kind of trend or, from your point of view, what's some of those most common legal pitfalls you're seeing operators falling into?
Well, legal pitfalls are interesting. I think they're in a particularly haulage is in a very hard market, with margins being very small, and the slightest saving of money is going to make a big difference. But if I was going to say, why do most operators go to public inquiry, for example, the answer to that question will be complacency. So what's happened is they've got a well-established business or a reasonably well-established business. They've run perfectly well for many years without coming to the attention of the authorities, which many operators do for the vast majority of their career. However, if anybody were to look at them, then they would observe that actually they'd fallen significantly behind the expectations of today. And I would say that was the majority of operators that we deal with.
And that kind of that complacency is an element of mindset and culture within a business. And, how would you advise operators to kind of reestablish a bit more focus within their own business on compliance being something alongside safety as a safety first policy in the way in which they operate, but also the education that leadership in the business should provide to the transport management team and every of all levels?
Well, you've made the point. I mean, the starting point is support and respect your transport manager. Furthermore, provide them opportunity for further learning. That's one of the biggest steps any operator can take. Listen to the transport manager. They should and do probably know what they're doing. If they don't, you need a new one. Secondly, get some form of independent assessment audit, compliance review, get some sort of independent assessment of your operation so that somebody's looking at you who hasn't got skin in the game. And that will tell you where you sit. You might not like the answers. You might be somewhat scared of that, but it's a very important step, I think, today.
And when we talk about culture, and then we talk about some of those common themes and trends that are taking place within our industry, distracted driving is becoming something of a topic. With many of different suppliers being a leading technology provider in that. Distracted driving is a serious risk, but what practical policies or procedures should businesses put in place to help manage that?
Well, that's an interesting question, arguably a leading question. However, I think distraction whilst driving is normal. Everybody who drives will at times be distracted whilst they're driving. We're all aware of it. We've all done it. We've all, looked at an advert on the side of the road or seen something going on the other side of the road that we've had more interest in and looked forward and realised we should have braked a moment or two earlier.
The rubberneck.
So, exactly. So I think distracted driving is a norm. Let's start there. But what I would say is there's a difference between the occasional very short-term distraction due to a one-off incident and regularly becoming distracted.
Behaviour.
So behavioural distraction. So, for example, sometimes you'll have a driver who may have a child who's in hospital or not very well, and they're waiting for a phone call from their partner who may be at the hospital with them. They're driving, but what they're really doing is thinking about their child and looking at their phone, waiting for that call. That is long-term, potentially dangerous distraction. And I think as an operator, steps you can take to try and avoid those things is to have a constant dialogue with your staff. Make sure that your drivers feel they can tell you when they've got these issues, and B, where drivers have got these issues, that you're making the decision perhaps they shouldn't go out today.
And do you think that comes down to we were speaking to Caroline Hicks from TVSA around, that producing a really world-class brief and debrief with the driver, because that's really your two tangible points throughout the day, be it if they've got a second turn, you've got two debriefs to complete. Do you think there's more focus around briefing and debriefing drivers as part of their shift, where operators can bring in, a next level of understanding of how their driver well-being is being, supported?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've not noticed a significant increase in the briefing and debriefing of drivers. In fact, I would go so far as to say that's massively dependent on the nature of the work you do. So very sophisticated operators who maybe operate daily type journeys, delivery routes, but just, let's say 6 till 5 in the afternoon type work, those sorts of drivers will have an opportunity to speak to somebody from the management team or supervisory team when they get back to base. And there may be an element of debrief goes on there with some of, as I say, more sophisticated operators. But for example, operators doing long distance trunking operations where drivers are away overnight all week, there's no real debrief takes place there. They just continue on those routes backwards and forwards. I think also who's carrying out the debrief and their skills is really important. I mean, you can't just say to somebody, look, I want you to speak to the drivers at the end of every day and ask them if they're okay. The driver just wants to go home. So I think when you're talking about, interaction with the drivers. I think it's got to be more human and more real.
Yeah, it's more personal.
I would argue actually that the drivers will be more frequently talking to whoever's planning their work. And might be talking to them during the day.
Well, when I used to be on shift, they were definitely shouting over the top of me as shift manager to my planner, Justin.
Well, exactly right.
Mainly having a few disagreements with what has been planned for the following day.
Yeah, and that establishing trusting relationships, but also having employment policies that support drivers when issues are arising. And yes, will you get drivers who take the mick? Yeah, you will get drivers who take the mick, but that's for you to manage. But you've got to enable a driver who's worried about something, who may be a good driver, but is scared to tell you because they fear they'll lose their job. What you need to do is encourage that person to step forwards.
And I guess there's a kind of accumulation of behaviour and culture there that leads to incidents. And are you seeing from your legal SME point of view, that there's more incidents where just operators are claiming we didn't know as a defence, and how does that stand up in court?
Well, as I said earlier, ignorance isn't bliss, and nor is it a defence. So saying you didn't know is never a defence. It can be an understood and justifiable reason for your failure, but it's never a defence. Now, what's interesting there is actually knowing, though, can make you guilty. So, for example, or should have known. So if you have technology on your vehicle, which is giving you information about the performance of a driver, and that technology, should you look at it properly, is going to tell you that that driver's performance is falling away. And then subsequently, because you haven't looked at it properly and you haven't dealt with it, even if you have noticed it, that driver has a serious incident, then that technology will also tell the investigating authorities that you should have known. And they will download it and they will look at it. And so if you then say, well, we didn't really know, is a court going to be sympathetic when the victim's family are sitting in the courtroom looking at the jury and the jury looking at them and think, well, you had all this information and you didn't use it? Are they going to be sympathetic? I think probably not. So we've got information available to us. Whether we wanted it or not, we have to look at it. And lifting the lid on it might feel like opening Pandora's box, but at least you're opening it before the accident.
Yeah, and if you had to write that kind of checklist for operators to protect themselves legally, what's that thing at the top of the list?
Well, I think I mentioned this before we spoke as well. I think my view on this is, and if an operator really wants to be a safe operator, really wants to be compliant, their starting point needs to be to make that decision. And then every decision that they make in their business thereafter needs to review, will it impact on compliance? Now, it's easy to say when a business is making money. So when a business is making money, they will, and a lot of the big restricted license holders are in this category, they're in a different industry, they're making a lot of money, they will spend the money. But an operator who is not significantly wealthy, is not making huge margins, and who can save by buying a cheaper vehicle or by extending their maintenance regime by a week, or by not necessarily buying all the equipment or courses for their drivers that actually the operation really requires. They're doing it to save money. They're doing it to make a profit. And you can't criticise people for wanting to make a profit. But what they've got to understand is every time they make a decision that potentially compromises compliance, then they are potentially compromising their whole business.
Yes, and bringing that to, I guess, something that's practical as a takeaway, one thing that an operator could do tomorrow to avoid ending up in court?
Well, the first thing to do is have an independent audit of your operation, and that'll tell you whether you're going to end up in court. And act on it. Don't just get the report. Act on the recommendations in the report, and then work to make sure that you're maintaining the standards that the report is telling you need to get to.
So then what would your kind of key message for operators, about protecting themselves legally and building that compliance culture within the business be for everybody, operating in the UK?
Yeah, compliance culture is a very interesting phrase. So culture, I think, is something that we haven't properly explored in this regulatory regime. We talk about being compliant and we talk about systems. But my biggest probably lesson or the biggest message I would send out there is to say, explain to the people you're training why you're asking them to do what you do. I'll give you a simple example, the walk around inspection. So ask a driver, why are you doing this walk around inspection? Most of them will probably say, well, because the vehicle needs to be fit and serviceable. Okay, what are the consequences if it isn't? And they may say, well, I might get a prohibition. And say, okay, well, you might get a prohibition. But what if it isn't and it's more serious than that? Well, something might happen. Like what? Well, I might have an accident. Okay, what could happen in that accident? Well, who knows? Could somebody die in that accident? Yes, somebody could die in that accident. Do you want somebody to die in an accident of a vehicle you're driving because you couldn't be bothered to do a walk-around inspection that morning? And that walk-around inspection may well have shown you what you needed to spot to prevent that happening. And suddenly they understand the why. And I think the biggest failure of many employers, actually, in many different industries, is they give systems to their employees, but they don't explain the why. And I think the why is the biggest single cultural shift that will bring people on board to what you're trying to achieve.
And I think that echoes some of the messages from Caroline and from Richard Turfitt around there needs to be a greater understanding of educating the workforce at our operators' businesses to understand their role that they have within that compliance program. Again, great example of using the walk around check, something that simple that has a huge detrimental effect if things were to go wrong out on the road.
Correct.
And that role that the driver has just by focusing on that 10 minutes, just getting it correct to feed into their role as part of that program.
The why.
Yes. So again, thank you very much, Jonathon, for your support today and your insights from a legal point of view. Thank you very much for you as the audience back at home. And again, stay tuned to listen to the up and coming podcasts with the rest of the guests.